All right, so now that we've talked about kind of an overview of the different macromolecules, we're going to start looking at macromolecules in detail. One of the first groups we're going to talk about are carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are the main energy molecules of the body. And so carbohydrates include molecules such as sugars, and then also longer molecules known as polymers of sugars. The primary source of dietary energy in animals is glucose. And glucose is what we would refer to as a monomer of carbohydrates. And glucose is this really energy rich organic molecule. And in efficient cellular respiration processes, one molecule of glucose can end up turning into potentially 36 ATP molecules, which is quite a bit of energy for our cellular processes. In plants, carbohydrates can serve not only as energy but also building blocks of the plant structure. So some of the longer carbohydrate polymers, which are known as polysaccharides, the plant's energy polysaccharides will be starch, so your starches, and then the structural polysaccharides will be cellulose. So you're probably familiar with cellulose. It makes up the structural components of plants. Really hard to digest, really hard to break down, which is one reason why ruminants have that microbiome in their guts. So the four-chambered stomachs and kind of adaptations to help digest those cellulose components, which is still really hard to digest, even though they have those adaptations. And in animals, the long polymer where we store those glucose molecules is known as glycogen. And our bodies can break down those glycogen molecules into individual glucose molecules and use that glucose for energy. And like I mentioned, the single carbohydrates, the single sugar molecules are known as monosaccharides. And the monosaccharides are the monomers of carbohydrates. So they can't be broken down into smaller sugar molecules. They are the smallest sugar molecule in the carbohydrate world. Again, a common example of monosaccharides is glucose. Another one is fructose, like you can get in fruit. Both of these molecules are simple sugars that we can find in, say, honey. What's interesting with glucose and fructose is they are what we call isomers of each other. Basically, they have the same molecular formula, but that those atoms are arranged in different shapes that give them different properties. So they have a different structural makeup. So here we have glucose on the left-hand side and fructose on the right-hand side. You can see that both of these molecules have the same molecular formula, so C6H12O6, but their structures are different. And those differences in those structures are highlighted here. So for example, in glucose, the last carbon has a double bond with an oxygen molecule, whereas the fifth carbon in fructose has that double bond with the oxygen molecule, therefore also making the number of hydrogens different on each of those molecules depending on which molecule you're looking at. And so that different structural arrangement can result in different properties of that organic molecule. And so that's just basically what an isomer is. Same formula, different structural arrangements of those atoms for that molecule. And like I had mentioned, monosaccharides, especially glucose, is the main energy source of cellular work. And I also mentioned in the overview section that a lot of the monosaccharides in our bodies will form ring structures in water. Okay, and here on this slide we have a couple of review questions. So just take a minute, pause the video, and see if you can answer these questions. Okay, so now that you've had a minute to think about these questions and try to answer them, the first one is all carbohydrates consist of one or more blank, also called simple sugars. This would be monosaccharides. All carbohydrates consist of one or more monosaccharides that are referred to as simple sugars. The second question is explain how glucose and fructose can have the same formula but different properties. And those different properties come about because of the different arrangements of the atoms in the molecular shapes, and therefore that different arrangement leads to different properties in those molecules. All right, so here we have a linear structure of glucose. So you can see carbons 1 through 6, and in water that linear structure will form the ring structure that we show in the middle. And then the right hand structure is what we call an abbreviated structure. Basically, with these abbreviated structures, it's known that at each angle there's a carbon atom, and on each of those carbon atoms you have that H and your OH, right? And so that's just known. The only way, and it's different whenever you have your functional groups, and generally we'll draw those functional groups on those abbreviated structure rings. And so if you ever see this, you'll know that, okay, there's carbon atoms there, there's hydroxyl and hydrogen molecules or atoms on that structure as well. Okay, so we talked about monosaccharides. Now we're going to talk about disaccharides. Disaccharides, so you can look at the term and kind of guess at what this is. So mono means one, so one sugar molecule. Disaccharides, di means two, so that means we've got two sugar molecules. And so a disaccharide is constructed from two sugar molecules through that dehydration reaction. And so your two monosaccharides will be put together through that dehydration reaction to make a disaccharide. An example of a disaccharide are things like maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Lactose is probably one of the molecules you're more familiar with. It's found in milk. Maltose is found in things like beer, your malt shakes, etc. And sucrose is basically just table sugar. And sucrose is also the main carbohydrate that we see found in plants. You may also have heard of high fructose corn syrup, and so this is just a commercial process where they take natural glucose and convert it into a much sweeter fructose molecule. All right, so now we have a video showing this dehydration process of glucose and fructose to make a disaccharide. All right, so that just kind of shows you how the dehydration looks in that chemical reaction, and then the different molecules that the different disaccharides you get as a result of those dehydration reactions. And here we just have a figure showing that as well. So you have your glucose and your galactose. You see the OH and hydrogen atoms highlighted, that's going to basically fall off and form that water molecule through that dehydration reaction. And then you end up with the disaccharide lactose, so basically a double sugar carbohydrate. Now, whenever you get molecules that have more than two sugar monomers, two monosaccharides, you end up with a molecule that's referred to as a polysaccharide. These are your very large, complex carbohydrates that can be the long chains, branching structures, etc. And starch is a good example of a polysaccharide. Starch is found in plants, so plants make starch through the process of photosynthesis. Starch is stored in plant cells and is used as energy for cellular processes, so cellular respiration. And whenever we eat plants, we can take those starch molecules and take the glucose off of those molecules and convert it into glycogen, and then use that glucose for our own energy. So here we have another video kind of showing the formation of polysaccharides. Right, and so with that, you see the three kind of big polysaccharides: starch, glycogen, and cellulose. So remember, starch is made by plants, glycogen is made by animals, and cellulose is also made by plants, but it's primarily a structural forming component that you see in plant cell walls. So for example, here is cellulose molecules in plants. You have glycogen molecules in human muscle tissue, and then you have your starches in potatoes, for example. And all of these are made up of many, many different glucose molecules. It's just the structures are slightly different. All right, so as I mentioned, glycogen is used by animal cells to store energy, and it can be broken down into individual glucose molecules that will then undergo cellular respiration to get the needed energy and ATP molecules for cellular processes to work. Cellulose is actually the most abundant organic compound that you can find on Earth. It forms cable-like structures that are used in plant cell walls to help with structural components of plants, and they can't be broken down by any enzyme that's produced by animals, which again is why ruminants have those microbiomes inside of their stomachs to help with the breaking down of cellulose products. And even then, it really doesn't break it down efficiently. They still lose a lot of it, a lot of those carbohydrates in the defecation process. All right, so that's it for our carbohydrate section. The next section that we're going to talk about is lipids, and so we will see you in that video.